The Houthis have, surprise, surprise, continued to attack U.S. ships and other commercial vessels in the Red Sea, even after we struck, and actually we conducted additional strikes in Yemen, illegal strikes in Yemen against their facilities, and their weapons capacity clearly hasn't slowed them down one bit. Let's put this up on the screen. The Houthis hit a U.S. ship. This was after the U.S. took this additional step, which I think the Houthis probably rightly see as like fairly meaningless, as designating them as a terror organization. The Houthi group said they hit the Genco Picardy bulk carrier with missiles, which resulted in a direct hit. U.S. military says the vessel was hit by a drone on Wednesday evening. Washington's new designation of the Houthis will require U.S. financial institutions to freeze Houthi funds, and its members will be banned from the U.S. Put the next one up on the screen. This comes on the heels of a different Houthi attack. They launched another attack on merchant shipping on Tuesday, just hours after the U.S. preemptively struck missiles in Yemen that were prepared to launch, according to a statement from U.S. CENTCOM. U.S. CENTCOM, by the way, said there were no injuries reported from the merchant ship. And Counterpoints covered this yesterday, but just to underscore how stupid and counterproductive this whole strategy has been, Shell has suspended Red Sea shipments amid fears of more Houthi attacks. We'll have to see whether this becomes a longer-standing issue, that CEO told the Wall Street Journal in Davos. So congratulations, you haven't slowed them down one bit. There was reporting, what was that, the New York Times, that said you really haven't degraded their offensive capabilities really one bit, because they are very mobile, they're very agile, they're very used to being bombed to hell all the time. So you haven't degraded their capacity. You certainly haven't degraded the will of the Yemeni people who overwhelmingly back them. And all these commercial vessels are like, okay, this is an active war zone now. There's no way that we're shipping through the Red Sea. So commercial shipping has only gone in the opposite direction of what you wanted.
Yeah, it's actually pretty terrifying to just realize how delicate, we talked about Taiwan and all this, with how delicate and asymmetric you can have an impact on the global economy with some of these choke points. I mean, actually, it's more surprising that it hasn't happened up until now.
True.
But it's probably a function of just technology, which is these Houthis are spending 40 grand on a drone, and we have to spend $100 million to destroy maybe 15% of their offensive capability. Even, if you just read the CENTCOM statement out this morning about the 14 new strikes, they say that they destroyed 14 missiles in their launchers as the Houthis were preparing to fire them. 2 U.S. officials said that the strikes were carried out with Tomahawk cruise missiles. I mean, these are 400 grand a pop every time we fire one of these. Fired by Navy vessels. Local news outlets in Yemen said that they had struck Houthi-controlled territory. They're still doing battle damage assessment.
Oh, what's the coalition doing here, Saagar? What are they doing for us?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's interesting. Every U.S. coalition ends up just being us dropping the bombs.
Yeah.
It's kind of great. And paying for it, by the way.
Occasionally the UK will do some little something.
Yeah, but we sell them the weapon, so it's not even real. So, because it's like, if you use our bomb to bomb somebody, then whatever. That's a whole other conversation. Let's put up the final part here, because it just demonstrates about the precarity of this, and this is kind of the function of this segment in looking at the Israel situation. The chief of staff of the IDF currently says that, quote, the likelihood of war in the north is higher than before. They made the remarks during actually visit to reserve forces in the north on Wednesday, amid growing fears of a war with Hezbollah. You, as pointed out, this Krystal, Gallant, the defense minister, also apparently said something very similar. We saw some remarks that came out from Ben Gvir, the right-wing politician inside of Israel. They really, really want, they want war with Israel. Or sorry, they want war with Hezbollah. It's clear. The military wants it. The defense establishment wants it. Netanyahu definitely wants it. The only people who don't want it is America. Now, it's relatively unclear whether Hezbollah wants it or not. They've been pretty, they've stayed out of it. They've had some tit-for-tat strikes. They've taken some casualties. The Israelis have taken some casualties. Both seem to realize how devastating and horrible the conflict would be. But it is clear to me that this is kind of like an Afghanistan-Iraq situation. Even when we were at war in Afghanistan, our defense establishment and top leaders, army and others, they really wanted to invade Iraq. It took 2 years to build the political case and all of that. Obviously, we're on an accelerated timeline and all of this, but if the political will is there at the top of the government, if they want to do this, then we should take it really, really seriously.
Yeah, that's right.
There's only really one check that could have happened on the U.S., which would have been like genuine small d democratic, revolt, I don't know how the Israeli public feels about something like this. I will give them credit for at least this, because they have mandatory enlistment. They are not stupid. They all watched 2006. It wasn't that long ago. Their sons and daughters had to fight with Hezbollah. So they could have some, at least input or try to campaign or something like against us, because they know too. They're a country that reads a lot of the news. They would know that thousands and thousands of them would die in a conflict like this, not to mention a lot more civilians, Israeli civilians would die in this than probably any October 7th, because of the sheer capability of Hezbollah from missiles and all that. On the other side, maybe they think of it as like a last stand. They're like, listen, October 7th was our 9/11. Now we have to do something, we have to make sure that this never happens again, and you can use the extension from Hamas to Hezbollah. I could see the Israeli public signing up for that and be like, sure, we're going to risk tens of thousands, but they'll ensure our security in the future.
Yeah.
I could see it going both ways, but I mean, it's pretty terrifying, because from a reserve perspective and military perspective, Israel's not doing very well right now. They had to pull a lot of their troops out of Gaza. A lot of their reserves, they're sending them back to the economy. If you get into war with Hezbollah, you're going to have to call every single one of those guys, not just back up, but they're in forever. They're in for a long time, for a long haul. This is not Hamas, a couple of month deployment. We're talking 15, 20 months or something like that.
The U.S. really, in a sense, went mad after 9/11,
Yeah,
and that was exploited, right, by neocons who had a long-standing agenda that they wanted to pursue, and it took them a very small amount of time to push for a war in Iraq that made absolutely no sense, and a indefinite war in Afghanistan that, initially, okay, go in and get bin Laden, that part made sense, but then whatever the hell we were doing after that, even the people who were in military leadership couldn't explain what we were doing, what the goals were, what counted as success, etc. So we went mad after 9/11. I think the Israeli public has gone mad after October 7th, and I think Netanyahu and co. are using that in a very similar way that the neocons use it to further their own ends and agenda, to further their own ends and agenda. The real response to what happened on October 7th was, listen, this idea that you can imprison people forever, that you can indefinitely thwart their basic rights to self-determination, control what's happening in their own territory, that you can have, this massive security establishment, all this high tech, and that's going to keep you safe. You're going to be able to quote unquote control the flames. Well, after the horror and humiliation of October 7th, that fell apart. So the real response is, okay, there is no military solution to this. There is no occupying force solution to this. The only actual solution to this is a diplomatic one. But of course, no one wants to hear that when they're in the midst of rage and fury and disgust and horror and pain and loss and suffering and all of that. So instead, the direction is not in favor of diplomacy. The direction is in favor of, we're going to do war even harder. We're going to crush Hamas. And by the way, those of you in northern Israel, we're going to crush Hezbollah too, so you don't have to worry about them either. That was our mistake, is that we didn't crush them and their ambitions and their spirit hard enough, that we weren't big enough assholes in the region to deter everyone from, ever messing with us. So we have to launch this insanely brutal, and I certainly would say in the ICJ South Africa case would agree, genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip. That's what we have to do to make sure no one messes with us ever again. And that's the logic that has taken hold with at least it appears, based on the polling, a majority of the Israeli public. And that's why these politicians think it's in their cynical best interest to continue the war going indefinitely and, bring home as many horrible military prizes as they possibly can.
It's a big question. I mean, we just don't know, right? Because it's like the U.S. public went along with it until they didn't go along with it. So
that took a long time, though.
Took 4 years.
Yeah.
A lot of people died in the interim. I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it's not like, it was actually kind of rapid sometimes if you think about it. By 04, 05 or so, people were at least beginning to have the conversation. We wanted to spare them. Yeah, everybody told them.
We re-elected George W. Bush.
Biden literally went over there and he's like, you really should not make the same mistakes as 9/11. And they didn't want to listen. So this is their problem. Unfortunately, to the extent that we cover a lot of this conflict, it's also it's our problem, because we're the ones bombing the Houthis, not the Israelis. We're the ones who are bearing bearing the vast majority of the cost, not the Israelis. And so they have always had this tremendous ability to outsource the vast majority of their problems, but that they get to keep all of the benefits to their overall security. Very, very unbalanced relationship, and they very much risk, I think, balancing it definitely in the wrong way in the long term, not necessarily in the short, when you can see so much of the domestic political situation shifting here. But why don't we get to our guest, the great guest?
Yeah, we have a great guest standing by to talk about some of the other sick incentives that constantly push us all towards more war and more conflict. Let's get to it. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.